In all my years beside my remarkable friend, Sherlock Holmes, there are certain nights which return to me with such peculiar vividness that I can scarcely persuade myself they belong to the ordinary procession of memory. One may forget 100 commonplace tragedies of London, yet retain forever the precise hiss of rain upon a windowpane, the yellow flare of a cab lamp through fog, or the expression upon a man's face when reason first abandons him. It was upon such a night, in the November of 1894, that the singular affair of the stranger waiting in my room first entered our lives. The weather had been abominable for 3 successive days. A dense and oily fog rolled through the arteries of London, creeping beneath doors and muffling every sound into ghostly softness. From the windows of our rooms in 221B Baker Street one could scarcely distinguish the opposite side of the street. The lamps burned like dim orange halos suspended in wool. Holmes lounged upon the sofa in his dressing gown, long fingers pressed together beneath his sharp chin. His violin lay neglected upon the chair beside him, while the air of our sitting room carried the lingering scent of strong shag tobacco and chemical acids from experiments earlier in the afternoon. I had been occupied with my notes when Holmes suddenly remarked, "You observe, Watson, that our visitor owns a black retriever, suffers from insomnia, and has within the past fortnight received distressing news from the continent." I glanced up in irritation. "My dear Holmes," said I, "there is no visitor. Not presently, but there will be." He inclined his head toward the umbrella stand near the door. There, among our own possessions, stood a heavy ash walking stick which neither Holmes nor I had seen before. "You perceive," said Holmes lazily, "the fresh mud from Hampstead Heath still clinging to the ferrule. The dog hairs are visible against the cloth strap. The owner has gnawed the amber mouthpiece from nervous habit. Furthermore, the Continental telegram protruding from his pocket was partially visible when he mistakenly entered our rooms an hour ago before Mrs. Hudson redirected him downstairs." I stared. "You mean the man has already been here?" "Briefly. He was greatly agitated. Observe also that he left his stick behind, which indicates a distracted state of mind unusual in a man otherwise meticulous." As if summoned by the words themselves, there came a hurried tread upon the staircase below. A moment later Mrs. Hudson entered, visibly unsettled. "There's a gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she, "though I must confess I do not care for the look of him." Holmes smiled faintly. "You rarely do, Mrs. Hudson." The lady lowered her voice. "He insists someone has been inside his chambers. Says the police laughed at him. And," she hesitated, "he seems half frightened out of his wits." "Excellent," said Holmes. "Pray show him up." The man who entered a moment later was perhaps 35 years of age, though anxiety had already whitened the hair at his temples. He was tall and well dressed, with the refined bearing of a professional gentleman. Yet it was his eyes which seized my attention at once. They darted continually toward the corners of the room, as though expecting movement where none existed. He clutched his gloves so tightly that the leather creaked. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "You have recovered your stick, Mr. Cavendish," said the visitor quickly. "Edwin Cavendish." Holmes motioned him to the chair beside the fire. "This is my colleague, Drive. Watson. You may speak freely before him." The man bowed distractedly toward me before sinking into the chair. For several moments he seemed unable to begin. Holmes watched him with half-closed eyes. "At what hour did you first discover the intruder in your room?" asked Holmes suddenly. Cavendish gave a violent start. "How could you possibly know that?" "My profession, Mr. Cavendish." The fellow passed a trembling hand across his brow. "I scarcely know where to begin," said he. "If the matter were not so infernally real I should believe myself to be losing my sanity." Holmes leaned back. "Proceed." "I reside alone in furnished chambers in Bloomsbury," said Cavendish. "For the past 3 weeks I have had the distinct impression that someone enters my rooms during my absence." "Have articles been stolen?" "No." "Moved?" "Yes, but only slightly." A chair turned toward the window. "A book laid open upon my desk." "Once, my bedroom mirror was covered with a cloth I distinctly remembered folding away." Holmes closed his eyes. "Continue." "At first I blamed my own carelessness. Then I suspected my landlady. But matters have become impossible." He swallowed hard. 3 nights ago I returned home shortly after midnight. My sitting room fire was burning low, though I had extinguished it before leaving. And upon the table beside the lamp stood a teacup still warm to the touch. I confess the story sent a slight chill through me. You informed the police? I asked. I did. They inspected the premises and found no sign of forced entry. One inspector hinted that overwork had affected my nerves. Holmes smiled thinly. The official imagination is rarely expansive. Cavendish leaned forward desperately. But that is not the worst of it, Mr. Holmes. No. The man's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Last evening I saw him. A silence fell over the room. Describe precisely what occurred, said Holmes. I had gone to bed around 11. Sometime later. I cannot say when exactly. I awoke with the strongest sensation that someone stood near me. His fingers shook violently now. The room was dark save for the dying coals in the grate. I looked toward the doorway and saw a figure seated calmly in the chair beside my bed. Mrs. Hudson, who lingered nervously near the door, uttered a faint exclamation. What sort of figure? Asked Holmes. A man, tall, thin, perfectly motionless. Could you distinguish his features? No, the light was too poor. But I know he was watching me. And then, I sprang up and struck a match. The room was empty. Holmes opened one eye. You searched the premises. Every inch. Doors locked. Windows bolted. You were certain you were fully awake. Cavendish rose abruptly. You think me mad as well. On the contrary, said Holmes calmly. I think you observant. Pray sit down. The man obeyed reluctantly. Holmes steepled his fingers. What occupation do you follow? I am a translator attached occasionally to the Foreign Office. Ah. Holmes glanced briefly toward me. I recognized that glimmer in his eye which always signaled the first alignment of unseen machinery within his brain. You have recently returned from Vienna, he continued. Yes. And before that, Prague. Cavendish stared. How? The reddish clay upon your trouser hems is peculiar to several streets presently under repair near the Moldau embankment. Also, your cigarette case bears the stamp of a tobacconist in the Josefov district. The man looked simultaneously impressed and unnerved. But what has this to do with my visitor? That remains to be seen. Holmes rose suddenly and crossed to the window. For nearly a minute he stood peering into the dense fog beyond Baker Street. Then, very quietly, he spoke. You have omitted one detail, Mr. Cavendish. The man stiffened. I have told you everything. No, there is something else. Something which frightened you far more than the appearance of this intruder. Cavendish's face lost what little color remained in it. Holmes turned slowly back toward him. What message did the stranger leave in your room? For one terrible instant I believed the man might faint outright. How could you know that? He whispered. Without answering, Holmes extended his hand. With shaking fingers, Cavendish withdrew a folded scrap of paper from his breast pocket. Holmes passed it silently to me. Upon the paper, written in uneven black ink, were only 6 words. I am still waiting in your room. A cold sensation traveled down my spine. Curious, murmured Holmes. Curious, cried Cavendish. Good God, man, it is monstrous. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Perhaps, said he softly. Yet the truly monstrous feature, Mr. Cavendish, is not that the message was left. He tapped the paper once with a long finger. It is that the ink upon these words is less than 24 hours old, while the paper itself is over 10 years old. Outside, somewhere deep within the fog-bound streets of London, a church bell began slowly to toll the hour. And thus began one of the most singular investigations ever to engage the powers of Sherlock Holmes. I have frequently observed that when Sherlock Holmes encountered a problem which genuinely stimulated his intellect, an extraordinary transformation overtook him. The languid dreamer vanished. In his place emerged a creature of cold precision and restless energy whose entire nervous system appeared sharpened toward a single objective. So it was upon the night Mr. Edwin Cavendish first placed before us that singular message. Holmes held the paper beneath the lamplight with delicate care, turning it slightly between his fingers while his keen gray eyes examined every fiber. You perceive, Watson, said he, the uneven yellowing near the edges. This sheet was folded for years before being reopened recently. Yet the ink remains fresh enough to retain a faint odor. He handed it to me. Sure enough, a subtle metallic scent lingered upon the black letters. Common writing ink? I asked. On the contrary, iron gall ink of Bohemian manufacture. Mr. Cavendish started visibly. Bohemian, indeed. Far less common in England than upon the continent. Holmes seated himself opposite our visitor. Now then, Mr. Cavendish, I must request complete frankness. There is clearly some portion of this affair connected with your travels abroad. The man hesitated. I have already told you everything relevant. Holmes sighed faintly. My dear sir, whenever a client assures me he has omitted nothing, it invariably signifies the precise opposite. Cavendish's face tightened. You do not understand. No, said Holmes quietly. But I intend to. For several moments only the crackle of the fire disturbed the silence. At last Cavendish spoke in a lower tone. When I was in Prague 3 years ago, I became acquainted with a gentleman named Anton Varga. Holmes's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. A Hungarian, yes, and a political exile. Cavendish stared. How can you possibly know that? My dear fellow, your nervous habit of glancing toward the window each time a cab passes suggests a man accustomed to surveillance. The Foreign Office connection confirms diplomatic entanglements. Continue. Cavendish drew a long breath. Varga was an unusual man. Brilliant, cultivated, intensely private. He claimed to possess information capable of embarrassing several governments. Holmes smiled thinly. The world overflows with men who make that claim. But Varga truly did possess dangerous knowledge. Ah, he translated confidential correspondence for certain officials in Vienna and Budapest. Through this work he acquired documents, letters, agreements, names of agents. And naturally, said Holmes, such a man accumulates enemies. Exactly. Cavendish leaned closer. One evening Varga confided to me that he feared assassination. He believed agents were following him through Prague. Did you believe him? At the time, only partially. He had a dramatic temperament. Holmes lit a cigarette. And what became of him? Cavendish swallowed. He disappeared. The wind moaned faintly beyond Baker Street, rattling the window panes. When? Asked Holmes. 10 years ago this month. And no trace was ever found. None. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Yet this paper upon which the message was written is itself 10 years old. Cavendish lowered his eyes. Yes. A silence followed. Was the paper Varga's? I asked. It came from his desk. Holmes leaned back slowly. Interesting. Cavendish rose abruptly and paced toward the hearth. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, I had nearly forgotten the entire matter until these disturbances began. Forgotten. Holmes arched an eyebrow. You strike me as a man not easily freed from memory. The other gave a bitter laugh. Then perhaps I merely attempted to forget. Holmes watched him intently. Tell me precisely what occurred on the night Varga vanished. For the first time genuine fear crossed Cavendish's face. I was the last man to see him alive. Even Holmes seemed more attentive now. He had summoned me to his apartment near the old Jewish quarter in Prague. When I arrived, he was extremely agitated. He claimed someone had entered his rooms repeatedly while he slept. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. The similarity is obvious, said he quietly. Cavendish nodded miserably. Varga insisted that objects had been moved exactly as in my own chambers now. Chairs repositioned, papers disturbed, lamps extinguished. And did he believe he knew the intruder? He refused to say. But before I left that evening he gave me an envelope and instructed me not to open it unless something happened to him. Did you obey? No. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What became of the envelope? Cavendish hesitated too long. You destroyed it, said Holmes. Yes. Without opening it. A pause. No. Holmes exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. What did it contain? A photograph. Of whom? Cavendish's voice had become barely audible. Of myself. Even Holmes appeared momentarily surprised. And why should Varga possess your photograph? I do not know. Was there anything unusual about it? Cavendish closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Well, written upon the back were the words, "He will wait where you sleep." For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Holmes rose with sudden energy. Watson, your revolver if you please. My revolver. We shall require it tonight. Cavendish looked alarmed. You believe the man may return? My dear sir, said Holmes, slipping on his coat, I should be disappointed if he did not. Within 20 minutes we were seated inside a hansom cab rattling eastward through the fog-veiled streets of London. Cavendish sat opposite us, pale and visibly strained, while Holmes remained sunk in thought. I had long since learned not to interrupt these periods of concentrated silence. At length Holmes spoke. Your landlady, does she possess keys to your chambers? Yes. And servants? Only a maid of all work. Has either behaved suspiciously? No. Holmes nodded absently. The cab turned into Bloomsbury, where rows of gloomy Georgian houses emerged dimly through the fog-like spectral cliffs. Cavendish occupied rooms upon the second floor of a narrow brick residence in Little Russell Street. A nervous elderly landlady admitted us. I tell him it's his imagination, said she anxiously. No one's been inside them rooms. Holmes merely smiled. Perhaps. We ascended the staircase. Cavendish's chambers proved comfortable though somewhat oppressive in atmosphere. Books crowded every wall. Heavy curtains obscured the windows. A coal fire smoldered weakly in the grate. Holmes examined the sitting room without speaking. He moved lightly from object to object with the swift precision of a hunting animal. Suddenly he paused beside the writing desk. What is it? I asked. He pointed silently. Upon the polished wood lay a thin line of pale gray ash. Tobacco, said I. No. Burned paper. He bent lower. And very recent. Cavendish stared. But I have burned nothing. Holmes crossed at once to the fireplace and stirred the embers with the poker. From among the ashes he extracted a half-charred fragment no larger than a postage stamp. He studied it beneath the lamp. A printed date, said he softly. 1884. Cavendish gave a strangled cry. That was the year Varga disappeared. Holmes slipped the fragment carefully into his pocket. Interesting. Extremely interesting. He next inspected the bedroom. The arrangement appeared ordinary enough. Narrow bed, wardrobe, washstand, and a single upholstered chair positioned beside the bed exactly where Cavendish claimed to have seen the seated figure. Holmes crouched suddenly beside the carpet. Watson. I joined him. There, he whispered. Near the leg of the chair was a tiny dark stain scarcely visible against the patterned carpet. Blood, I murmured. Holmes touched it delicately. No. Ink. He sniffed his fingertips. The same bohemian compound. Cavendish sank weakly onto the bed. My God. Holmes rose. You shall not sleep here tonight. Then you believe me at last. My dear fellow, said Holmes, I believed you from the moment you entered Baker Street. The question was never whether your visitor exists. Then what question remains? Holmes's face became grave. Whether the visitor is truly alive. At that instant a sudden sound broke the silence. 3 slow knocks. Not upon the outer door below, but directly upon the bedroom wall beside us. Cavendish sprang to his feet with a cry. Again came the knocks. Deliberate. Measured. 3 exactly. Holmes's eyes flashed. Without hesitation he crossed the room and pressed his ear against the wallpaper. The knocking ceased. A dreadful stillness followed. Then, faintly, so faintly I could scarcely swear to it at all, there came the sound of breathing on the opposite side of the wall. Holmes turned toward us slowly. There is no adjoining room, whispered Cavendish. And for the first time since I had known him, I observed upon Sherlock Holmes's face an expression very near to genuine astonishment. There are moments in life when even the most rational mind feels the cold pressure of primitive fear. I confess freely that as I stood in the dimly lit bedroom of Mr. Edwin Cavendish, listening to that faint breathing beyond a wall which should have concealed nothing but brick and winter air, my nerves experienced a sensation wholly unfamiliar to me. Yet if Sherlock Holmes felt anything similar, he concealed it instantly beneath the armor of his intellect. He placed one hand sharply against the wallpaper. Solid, said he quietly. Again came silence. Holmes rapped twice upon the wall with his knuckles. No answer. Then, with sudden energy, he seized the lamp from the bedside table and motioned us backward. Stand clear. What are you about to do? Cried Cavendish. Verify architecture. Before either of us could interfere, Holmes drove his shoulder violently against the paneled wall. The structure shuddered, but held firm. Extraordinary, he muttered. I joined him, and together we examined the surface more carefully. It appeared perfectly ordinary. Faded green wallpaper, cracked slightly near the skirting board, with no visible seam or hidden doorway. Holmes dropped to one knee. What is it? I asked. He pointed toward the floor. A narrow current of cold air drifted upward between the boards nearest the wall. There is empty space beyond, said Holmes softly. But that is impossible, cried Cavendish. The exterior wall faces the alley. Holmes rose immediately. Come, Watson, we shall inspect the alley. Within minutes we had descended the staircase and emerged into the bitter fog outside. The narrow lane beside the building was deserted save for overflowing rubbish bins and the gleam of rainwater upon cobblestones. Holmes paced slowly along the outer wall beneath Cavendish's windows. His lantern illuminated wet brickwork blackened by decades of London soot. Then suddenly he stopped. Observe. I bent closer. One section of the wall bore faint scrape marks, almost invisible beneath the grime. Fresh, said Holmes. From what? Something metallic. Frequently moved. Cavendish stared upward nervously. But there is no entrance there. Holmes's lantern moved downward again. Near ground level, concealed partially behind stacked crates, lay a narrow iron hatch scarcely 2 feet high. Good heavens, I exclaimed. Holmes knelt instantly and brushed away dirt from the rusted lock. A maintenance access, said he. Likely forgotten years ago. Can it be opened? Holmes tested it carefully. Recently oiled, he remarked. Cavendish recoiled. You mean someone uses it? Undoubtedly. Holmes drew from his pocket a slim steel instrument and inserted it delicately into the lock. Within seconds came a click. The hatch swung inward with a low groan. A gust of stale air issued forth carrying the odor of damp stone and extinguished candles. Holmes lifted the lantern. A narrow passage extended beneath the building. My dear Holmes, said I, surely we are not about to crawl into that infernal place. My dear Watson, said he cheerfully, we most certainly are. I have followed Holmes into opium dens, murderers' lairs, and plague-ridden alleys, yet I admit I took little pleasure in squeezing through that cramped opening into the darkness beneath the house. The passage proved barely wide enough for a man to crouch within. Ancient brick arches dripped moisture overhead. Rats scurried somewhere beyond the reach of the lantern. Holmes advanced silently ahead of us. After perhaps 20 feet, the tunnel widened unexpectedly into a concealed chamber directly beneath Cavendish's rooms. The sight awaiting us there froze us where we stood. The chamber was furnished, not richly, but deliberately. There stood a narrow cot, neatly folded blankets. Upon it, a small table, candles, a kettle, several books stacked carefully against the wall, and beside the cot lay dozens of loose papers covered in handwriting. Cavendish uttered a strangled gasp. Dear God! Holmes moved swiftly to the table. The dust patterns immediately drew his attention. He left in haste, said he. You believe the intruder was here tonight? I asked. Holmes pointed silently toward the kettle. Steam still rose faintly from its spout. Cavendish staggered backward against the wall. He was listening to us. Beyond question. Holmes next examined the papers scattered across the table. I picked one up myself and felt an immediate chill. Every page contained writing about Cavendish. Notations, observations, dates, times. One read, he slept poorly again. Continues checking the window before extinguishing lamp. Another, still does not remember Prague fully. And another, when recognition comes, danger will follow. Cavendish snatched the paper from my hand. This is madness. Holmes remained calm. No, it is surveillance. But by whom? That, said Holmes quietly, is precisely our difficulty. He lifted another sheet nearer the lantern. Unlike the others, this page bore only a single sentence written repeatedly over and over in increasingly erratic script. He must not open the red room. He must not open the red room. He must not open the red room. Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. The red room. Cavendish looked utterly bewildered. I know nothing about any red room. Perhaps not consciously. Holmes folded the page and slipped it into his pocket. Then his attention shifted suddenly toward the far side of the chamber. There has been another occupant here. How can you tell? I asked. 2 distinct tobacco ashes. One Turkish. One strong black Hungarian blend. Cavendish whispered. Varga smoked Hungarian tobacco. Holmes looked up sharply. Precisely. A terrible silence descended. At length I said what all 3 of us had begun secretly to fear. You cannot seriously suppose Anton Varga has remained hidden beneath this house for 10 years. No, said Holmes. Then who? Holmes raised one finger. Listen. From somewhere above us came the creak of floorboards. Someone was moving inside Cavendish's bedroom. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed us whole. Again came the sound overhead. Slow footsteps. Measured. Not hurried in the least. Cavendish clutched my arm so tightly it hurt. Holmes leaned upward, every nerve alert. Then another sound drifted down through the ceiling. A voice, soft, male, speaking in a foreign tongue. Cavendish gave a muffled cry. "It's him." "Silence," hissed Holmes. The unseen speaker continued for several moments before stopping abruptly. Then came the scrape of the bedroom chair moving across the floor directly above us. Holmes's hand closed around my wrist. Without warning he darted toward the tunnel entrance with astonishing speed. We scrambled after him through the narrow passage and emerged breathlessly into the alley behind the house. Holmes raced toward the front entrance. By the time we burst into Cavendish's chambers the room stood empty. But the chair beside the bed had been turned to face the doorway. And upon the pillow lay a fresh sheet of paper. Holmes seized it at once. This message contained only 4 words. "He remembers nothing yet." Cavendish collapsed into the chair, trembling violently. Holmes, however, appeared almost exhilarated now. "Well," said he softly, "our unknown friend grows careless." "You call this careless?" I cried. "Yes, because fear has entered the game." He turned suddenly toward Cavendish. "One final question, sir. During your years abroad, did you ever hear mention of a place, or organization, known as the Red Room?" Cavendish's expression altered subtly. For an instant something flickered deep within his memory. Then he pressed both hands against his temples. I do not know." Holmes stepped closer. "But you have heard the phrase before." "Yes," whispered Cavendish at last. "In Prague." "From whom?" "Varga." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And what did he say?" Cavendish swallowed hard. "He said that if the Red Room ever found him, no wall in Europe could keep him safe." Outside, somewhere lost within the dense London fog, a police whistle suddenly shrilled. Then another answered it. Holmes crossed swiftly to the window. A grim smile touched his thin lips. "It appears," said he, "that our night's work has only just begun." The shrill whistles outside had scarcely ceased echoing through the fog when Sherlock Holmes seized his coat and strode toward the door with that abrupt decisiveness which always signified a new development in the case. "Come, Watson." Cavendish sprang up anxiously. "You are not leaving me here alone." Holmes paused. "My dear sir, if your mysterious visitor wished you dead, he has already enjoyed ample opportunity." "That is hardly reassuring." "No," said Holmes candidly, "but it is logical." We descended to the street where the night air struck cold and damp against our faces. The fog had thickened still further, drifting in slow yellow coils beneath the gas lamps. Somewhere nearby voices shouted in agitation. A constable emerged from the gloom at a run and nearly collided with us. "You there," he cried. "Stand clear." Holmes caught the fellow lightly by the sleeve. "What has occurred, officer?" "Murder, sir." Cavendish uttered a faint groan behind us. "Where?" asked Holmes sharply. The constable pointed toward the adjoining street. "Little Gilbert Lane. Gentleman found stabbed not 10 minutes ago." Holmes's expression altered instantly. "Lead on." We hurried after the man through winding fog-bound alleys until a crowd of curious onlookers became visible beneath the lamps ahead. Policemen struggled to maintain order while an ambulance cart stood waiting nearby. In the center of the disturbance, sprawled against a brick wall, lay the body of a man. Even before we approached closely, I observed the dark stain spreading across his coat front. An inspector I recognized at once turned irritably as we advanced. "Holmes," said he, "just what I needed." It was Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, a capable officer whose confidence generally exceeded his imagination. "You appear displeased to see me," remarked Holmes pleasantly. "I was getting along admirably before you arrived." "Then the corpse must have murdered itself." Gregson snorted. "Not this time." Holmes crouched beside the body. The victim was a thick-set man of perhaps 50 years with heavy whiskers and a foreign appearance. His hat had fallen nearby into the gutter. "One wound," I observed. "Aye," said Gregson. "Straight into the heart." Holmes examined the dead man's hands. "Interesting. What now?" muttered Gregson. "No signs of struggle." The fellow trusted his attacker. Gregson folded his arms smugly. "Exactly. Which is why the case is practically solved." Holmes glanced up. "Indeed." The inspector pointed dramatically toward the victim's clenched right hand. There, between the stiffening fingers protruded a scrap of dark fabric torn from someone's sleeve. Gregson continued triumphantly. "Our suspect was apprehended attempting to flee not 2 streets away." Holmes rose slowly. "And who might that be?" Gregson turned toward two constables standing nearby. Bring him forward. The prisoner they escorted into the lamplight caused Cavendish to recoil with visible horror. It was a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and a narrow foreign face. His dark overcoat bore a jagged tear at the sleeve exactly matching the cloth fragment found in the dead man's hand. But it was not merely the resemblance which shocked Cavendish. It was recognition. "You," he whispered. The prisoner stared back coldly. For one dreadful instant neither man spoke. Then the stranger smiled faintly. "Good evening, Mr. Cavendish." Gregson looked between them sharply. "Ah, so you know each other." Holmes's gaze flickered instantly toward Cavendish. "Well," Cavendish swallowed hard. "That man, his name is Emil Drachin." The prisoner inclined his head slightly. "You remember me after all." Gregson rubbed his hands with satisfaction. "Excellent. Things become clearer by the minute." Holmes remained silent. "Who is he?" I asked quietly. Cavendish answered without taking his eyes from the prisoner. "He worked with Anton Varga in Prague." At the mention of the name, Drachin's expression altered almost imperceptibly. "Worked for him," he corrected softly. "A distinction worth noting." Gregson stepped forward impatiently. "Enough foreign nonsense. The dead man's named Karl Meissner. Also Hungarian. Witnesses saw Drachin arguing with him earlier tonight." Holmes examined the prisoner carefully. Drachin stood, perfectly composed despite the circumstances. His calmness struck me at once as unnatural in a man accused of murder. "You deny the charge?" asked Holmes. "I deny nothing," said Drachin. Gregson grunted. "There, you see." Holmes ignored him. "You were acquainted with the deceased?" "Yes." "And with Anton Varga?" A pause. "Yes. Interesting company you keep," said Holmes. Drachin's eyes shifted briefly toward him. "And you, Mr. Holmes, ask dangerous questions." Gregson clapped a hand upon the prisoner's shoulder. "You'll answer plenty more before morning." As the constables prepared to lead him away, Drachin suddenly addressed Cavendish directly. "He still waits, you know." Cavendish turned pale as death. Gregson frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" But Drachin merely smiled again. "Ask Mr. Cavendish about the Red Room." Holmes's eyes flashed sharply. Before another word could be exchanged, the prisoner was marched off into the fog. Gregson looked immensely pleased with himself. A clean arrest. Motive still uncertain, but we'll have it by dawn. Holmes stooped suddenly beside the corpse once more. "What are you doing now?" demanded Gregson. "Correcting your investigation." He pointed toward the dead man's boots. "Mud." Gregson blinked. "Well, white clay mixed with chalk dust." "So." Holmes straightened. "There is no such soil anywhere near this district. Your victim came here recently from another location." Gregson shrugged. "What of it? It means he was brought here, or lured here, for a purpose." The inspector rolled his eyes. "Holmes, you complicate everything." "Because everything is complicated." Holmes next turned his attention to the wall behind the body. There, faintly visible beneath the gaslight, someone had drawn a symbol in black chalk. A circle. Inside it, a red triangle crudely smeared with what appeared almost to be blood. Cavendish gave a hoarse cry. Holmes seized his arm instantly. "You recognize it?" "Yes. From Prague." Cavendish nodded weakly. "Varga showed it to me once. He said it marked the agents of the Red Room." Gregson scoffed loudly. "Oh, splendid. Secret societies now." Holmes, however, remained grave. "Perhaps not as fanciful as you suppose." He leaned closer to the symbol. Then abruptly his expression hardened. "Watson." "Yes. Observe the lower edge." I bent near. Beneath the chalk mark were several tiny scratches upon the brick. "Letters. Not English." Holmes whispered the words aloud. "Pamatuj na pokaj." "What does it mean?" I asked. Before Holmes could answer, Cavendish spoke in a trembling voice. "It is Czech." "Well, it means, remember the room." A cold silence followed. Gregson finally waved impatiently toward the ambulance men. "Take the body away." As they lifted the corpse, something slipped from the dead man's coat and fell into the gutter unnoticed by everyone save Holmes. With astonishing swiftness he stooped and pocketed the object before Gregson turned back. I recognized at once the familiar glimmer in Holmes's eye. He had found something important. Yet he said nothing. Instead he merely turned toward Cavendish. "You shall accompany Watson back to Baker Street tonight." "And you?" I asked. Holmes buttoned his coat against the fog. I intend to pay a visit to a gentleman in Whitechapel who deals in certain continental information. At this hour, my dear Watson, said he dryly, the respectable citizens of London are asleep at this hour. The useful ones are not. Cavendish looked frightened anew. You do not mean to leave me unprotected? Holmes studied him thoughtfully. My dear sir, the most dangerous thing pursuing you tonight may not be Emil Drachin. What do you mean? Holmes's face became unreadable once more. That, said he softly, is exactly what I hope to discover. And without another word, Sherlock Holmes vanished alone into the London fog. It is one of the peculiar frustrations of life with Sherlock Holmes that a man may stand beside him through the gravest dangers, share his lodgings, his meals, and even bullets meant for his heart, yet still remain excluded from the central chambers of his reasoning. So it was during the strange days which followed the murder in Little Gilbert Lane. Holmes returned to 221B Baker Street shortly after dawn, pale from exhaustion but possessed of that hard brightness in the eyes which always indicated mental excitement. I had remained awake in the sitting room beside Mr. Cavendish, whose nerves were by now stretched to the very limit. The poor fellow started violently at every sound from the street below. Holmes entered without a word, removed his gloves, and crossed immediately to the chemical table near the window. Well? I asked eagerly. He ignored the question. Instead he withdrew from his pocket the small object he had secretly taken from the murdered man beside Gregson's feet. It proved to be a brass key. Not remarkable in itself, save for one detail. The number 47 had been engraved upon it in deep black enamel. Holmes held it thoughtfully beneath the lamp. Curious. You discovered where it belongs? I asked. No. Then what have you learned? Holmes glanced briefly toward Cavendish. That our dead Hungarian was frightened. Cavendish looked up sharply. How can you tell? This key was hidden inside the lining of his coat rather than carried normally. Men conceal only what they fear losing. He next produced a folded slip of paper from another pocket. This, said he, I acquired in Whitechapel. I leaned forward eagerly. The paper contained only an address. 47 Kronenstrasse. Beneath it appeared a single word written hurriedly in pencil. Prague. Cavendish went visibly pale. Kronenstrasse, he whispered. That was where Varga lived. Holmes lit his pipe. Precisely. I stared at him. But Varga vanished 10 years ago. So we are repeatedly informed. The irony in Holmes's voice did not escape me. Cavendish rose suddenly. You cannot seriously believe Anton Varga is alive. Holmes regarded him steadily through the smoke. My dear sir, at present I believe nothing absolutely. I merely observe that dead men seldom maintain furnished hiding places beneath London houses. That chamber could belong to anyone. Indeed. Holmes sank into his chair. Which is why I intend to examine the matter from another direction. He closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. Watson, do you recall the final message left upon Cavendish's pillow? He remembers nothing yet. Yes. The wording interests me profoundly. In what way? Holmes opened one eye. It suggests the writer fears memory. Cavendish gripped the arm of his chair. Memory of what? That, said Holmes softly, is precisely the point. For much of that morning Holmes remained immersed in documents, maps, and newspaper archives relating to Prague during the previous decade. He consulted old foreign reports with extraordinary concentration while I attempted unsuccessfully to piece together his conclusions. At noon Inspector Gregson arrived from Scotland Yard wearing an expression of immense satisfaction. Well, Holmes, said he cheerfully, our friend Drachin is talking. Holmes looked up lazily. How unfortunate. Gregson blinked. What do you mean unfortunate? A confessing criminal is often the greatest obstacle to truth. The inspector snorted. You'll sing a different tune after hearing this. Drachin admits knowing the dead man and admits following Cavendish. Cavendish recoiled. You see, cried Gregson triumphantly. Case nearly finished. Holmes puffed silently upon his pipe. What motive does he offer for the murder? Gregson hesitated. He refuses to discuss that part. Ah. But he claims the dead man betrayed certain political associates years ago in Prague. Holmes nodded faintly. A convenient explanation. Gregson frowned. You still think he's innocent? I think, said Holmes carefully, that a man intelligent enough to evade capture for years rarely commits murder in an alley while carrying identifiable evidence upon his sleeve. The inspector looked irritated. There was blood on the coat. Human blood. Well, Not yet confirmed. Holmes smiled slightly, then let us postpone the hanging. Gregson's patience visibly thinned. You always do this, Holmes. Every case turns into some grand hidden conspiracy in your mind. Not every case, only the interesting ones. Before Gregson could retort, Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a tray of tea. Another gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Name. He wouldn't give one. Holmes sat upright immediately. Show him in. The visitor who entered a moment later was among the most singular individuals I have ever encountered. He was enormously tall yet painfully thin, dressed in an immaculate black coat despite the filthy weather outside. A silk scarf concealed much of his face, while dark spectacles hid his eyes entirely. Yet it was not his appearance which startled us. It was his accent, strongly continental. The man bowed slightly. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes gestured toward a chair. You possess an advantage over us, sir. The stranger remained standing. I come only briefly. His voice carried a curious strained quality, as though recovering from illness or injury. What do you wish? Asked Holmes. To offer advice. Holmes smiled faintly. I rarely receive useful advice. The stranger ignored the remark. Mr. Cavendish is in danger. We are aware of that. No, said the man sharply. You are not. Something in his tone silenced the room entirely. Holmes studied him with sudden intensity. You know Anton Varga, he said quietly. The stranger's gloved hands tightened almost imperceptibly. At one time, was he murdered? A pause. No. Cavendish sprang from his chair. Then he lives. The stranger turned slowly toward him. He survives. The distinction struck me at once as ominous. Holmes leaned forward. Where is he? I cannot say. You mean you will not? Both. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps you can explain the significance of the Red Room. At those words the visitor became utterly motionless. Even through the spectacles I sensed the intensity of his gaze. You should abandon this investigation, he said softly. Why? Because you are approaching something extremely dangerous. Holmes laughed quietly. My dear sir, that sentence has followed me through half of Europe. The stranger stepped closer. You do not understand. The Red Room is not a society. It is an operation. Holmes's expression sharpened instantly. Go on. For years certain governments employed unofficial men for unofficial tasks. Assassinations. Blackmail. Disappearances. Gregson scoffed. Nonsense. The stranger ignored him completely. Varga discovered names, accounts, agents embedded throughout Europe. And Drachen? Asked Holmes. One of them. Cavendish whispered. Good God. Holmes remained perfectly calm. Then why is Cavendish pursued? The stranger turned toward him slowly. Because Anton Varga entrusted him with something. I received nothing. The man's voice hardened. You may not remember receiving it. Holmes's eyes flashed. There it was again. Memory. Always memory. Before Holmes could press further, the stranger suddenly stiffened. He glanced sharply toward the window. Then, with startling urgency, he spoke. They have already found you. What do you mean? But the man was already moving toward the door. Holmes sprang up. One moment. The stranger paused only briefly. If you value your lives, he said quietly, do not sleep tonight in the same rooms twice. And then he was gone. Holmes rushed instantly to the window overlooking Baker Street. I joined him. Far below, partly obscured by fog, stood a solitary figure upon the pavement opposite. Watching the windows of Baker Street. Even at that distance something about the posture seemed chillingly familiar. Cavendish gave a hoarse whisper behind us. The chair. What? That is how the man sat beside my bed. Holmes stared downward intensely. Then suddenly the figure stepped backward into the fog and vanished. Gregson exhaled irritably. This grows theatrical. Holmes, however, had gone very still. He crossed silently back to the fireplace and removed from the mantel the paper bearing the repeated warning. He must not open the Red Room. For several seconds he examined it without speaking. Then at last he murmured. Watson, I believe our unknown correspondent has made a mistake. What sort of mistake? Holmes looked up slowly. The kind, said he, which gets men killed. And for the remainder of that day he would say nothing further. If there existed one quality in Sherlock Holmes more maddening than his secrecy, it was his ability to become simultaneously more active and less communicative whenever a case approached some hidden turning point. The day following the visit of the mysterious foreign gentleman was among the most oppressive I can recall. Holmes scarcely touched food, consumed an alarming quantity of tobacco, and vanished repeatedly from 221B Baker Street without explanation. Each time he returned, he carried some fresh fragment of information which he refused fully to share. Meanwhile, poor Cavendish deteriorated visibly under the strain. He had taken temporary refuge in our Baker Street rooms at Holmes's insistence, though even there he seemed incapable of rest. More than once during the afternoon I observed him start violently at ordinary street sounds below. By evening, the fog had thickened once more until London appeared transformed into some monstrous dream city of muffled wheels, distant lamps, and unseen footsteps. Holmes stood beside the fire with hands clasped behind his back. "Watson," said he suddenly, "how long have you known me?" "Nearly 10 years. And during that time, how often have you seen me genuinely uncertain?" I considered. "Rarely." "Exactly." He smiled thinly. "Which is why this affair interests me. You are uncertain now." Holmes turned toward me. "I possess pieces, but not arrangement. There are too many actors concealed behind the curtain." Before I could reply, Cavendish entered hurriedly from the adjoining bedroom. "You must help me, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's expression sharpened instantly. "What has occurred?" Cavendish held out a trembling hand. In it lay a small brass object. The very key Holmes had recovered from the murdered Hungarian. I stared. "But Holmes had that key this morning." "So I did," said Holmes softly. Cavendish looked half deranged. "I found it upon my pillow." A dreadful silence filled the room. Holmes took the key carefully. "Interesting, interesting," cried Cavendish. "Good God, man, someone entered this room while we sat here." Holmes examined the key beneath the lamp. Then his eyes narrowed. "This is not the same key." "What?" "The engraving differs slightly." He handed it to me. Sure enough, the numeral 7 possessed a sharper angle than before. "A duplicate," said Holmes. "But why?" I asked. "To communicate." Cavendish sank weakly into a chair. "I cannot endure much more of this." Holmes's face softened slightly. "My dear fellow, fear is precisely what our unknown adversary desires." "And if he desires murder?" Holmes's gaze hardened again. "Then he has delayed curiously long in accomplishing it." At that moment Mrs. Hudson burst into the room in visible alarm. "Mr. Holmes, there's been another attack." Holmes seized his coat instantly. "Where?" "In Bloomsbury, sir. The police came asking for Mr. Cavendish." Cavendish went pale as ashes. Within minutes we were once more racing through fog-shrouded streets inside a hansom cab, Holmes unusually silent beside me. At last he spoke quietly. "If my suspicions prove correct tonight, Watson, the entire case alters." "How so?" "Because we may discover whether the hunter pursues Cavendish." He paused. "Or protects him." I stared. Before I could question him further, the cab stopped sharply outside Cavendish's lodging house in Little Russell Street. The scene awaiting us was chaos. Police lanterns illuminated the narrow street while frightened residents crowded the pavement. Gregson stood near the entrance barking orders at constables. He turned sharply as we approached. "Holmes, about time. What has happened?" Gregson jerked a thumb upward. "Your friend's rooms were broken into." Cavendish gave a strangled cry. "My God, any injuries?" asked Holmes quickly. "One." Gregson's face darkened. "The landlady." We hurried upstairs. The sight inside Cavendish's chambers was startling. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves. It was not ordinary burglary. It was a search. Holmes moved swiftly through the wreckage, his eyes missing nothing. "Where is Mrs. Willoughby?" he asked. "In the kitchen below," said Gregson. "Blow to the head." She interrupted the intruder. Holmes crouched beside the writing desk. The hidden passage beneath the house had been forced open completely now. "He came through there," said Gregson triumphantly. "Exactly as we suspected." Holmes said nothing. I noticed instead that his attention had fixed upon the bedroom doorway. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He pointed. 3 marks had been scratched into the wood. Parallel, deep, almost like claw marks. Gregson shrugged. "Probably from forcing the lock." "No," said Holmes softly. "Not from outside." A curious expression crossed his face. He entered the bedroom slowly. Everything there remained untouched save for one object. The chair beside the bed. It faced once more toward the doorway. Upon its seat lay a photograph. Cavendish stared at it with horror. My God, it was the same photograph he had described earlier, the image Anton Varga once gave him in Prague. A younger Cavendish stared back from the faded surface. Holmes turned it over carefully. Fresh words had been written across the back in black ink. You opened it at last. Cavendish pressed both hands against his face. I never should have come to you. Holmes ignored him. Instead he studied the room with increasing intensity. Then suddenly he dropped to one knee beside the bed. Ah, what now? Asked Gregson irritably. Holmes held up a tiny object between finger and thumb. A spent matchstick. But unlike English matches, its tip was stained blue. Bohemian sulfur, murmured Holmes. Gregson rolled his eyes. You and your foreign matches. Holmes stood abruptly. Inspector, where precisely was Mrs. Willoughby attacked? On the stairs. And did she see the intruder? Gregson hesitated. She claims she did. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Claims. Well, the woman's badly shaken. Says the fellow wore no shoes. A chill traveled through me. No shoes, repeated Cavendish faintly. Gregson nodded reluctantly. She swears she heard no footsteps at all. The room fell silent. Then Holmes asked quietly, what description did she give? Gregson glanced uneasily toward Cavendish before answering. She said the man looked dead. Cavendish nearly collapsed. Holmes, however, appeared more alert than frightened now. He crossed swiftly toward the hidden chamber beneath the floor. Watson, lantern. I followed him downward into the concealed room while Gregson and Cavendish remained above. The underground chamber had been ransacked even more violently than the apartment. Books torn apart, papers burned, furniture smashed, yet Holmes paid little attention to the destruction itself. Instead he crouched beside the wall nearest the cot. There, barely visible in the brick dust, appeared several lines scratched hurriedly by some sharp object. I held the lantern closer. The writing was uneven and desperate. Run before he remembers. Holmes became utterly still. At last, after days of hints and fragments. The message had changed. Not he remembers nothing yet. Not he must not open the red room. But, run before he remembers. Holmes rose slowly, and for the first time since this strange affair began, I saw genuine alarm enter his face. What is it? I whispered. He turned toward me with extraordinary gravity. Watson, I believe Cavendish himself may be the central danger in this entire case. Above us, from somewhere inside the room's overhead, there suddenly came a scream. A woman's scream. Then the crash of breaking glass. Holmes sprang toward the tunnel instantly. We burst upward into the apartment to find Gregson standing frozen near the shattered window while Cavendish had vanished completely. Only the curtains moved wildly in the cold night air. And upon the sill, illuminated by the gaslight beyond, lay a fresh trail of blood. For one terrible instant after discovering the open window and the blood upon the sill, all movement inside the shattered chamber seemed suspended. The curtains billowed inward upon the cold night air while somewhere below in the fog-filled street voices cried out in alarm. Then Sherlock Holmes sprang into motion with astonishing speed. To the alley, Watson. We rushed from the room, nearly overturning Inspector Gregson in our haste, and thundered down the staircase into Little Russell Street. The fog outside had grown so dense that men appeared and vanished within yards like phantoms. A small crowd had already gathered near the rear alley where excited constables waved lanterns uselessly through the murk. Which way? Holmes demanded sharply. A young policeman pointed nervously. Thought I heard running toward Bedford Lane, sir, but there was another man as well. Another man? Yes, sir. Tall fellow. Thin. Holmes uttered a low exclamation. Dratchen. Gregson emerged behind us, red-faced and furious. This is madness. How does a wounded man vanish into fog beneath half a dozen constables? Holmes ignored him completely. He crouched near the alley mouth, lantern raised low. At first I perceived nothing unusual upon the wet cobblestones. Then Holmes pointed. Blood. Tiny droplets gleamed darkly against the stones. He's injured badly, I asked. No. Holmes touched one stain lightly. Surface wound only. Gregson swore under his breath. Then why flee? Holmes rose slowly. That, said he quietly, is becoming increasingly interesting. We followed the blood trail through twisting lanes for nearly 15 minutes. Several times it vanished entirely before Holmes rediscovered it with uncanny precision. At length the trail led us into a narrow court hemmed in by decaying warehouses. There it ended. No further blood, no footprints, nothing. Gregson looked triumphant. He doubled back. Holmes stood perfectly still. No. He turned slowly toward the buildings surrounding us. One of these warehouses has a rear exit. How can you tell? Because our fugitive was assisted. Gregson groaned aloud. Again with the conspiracies. But Holmes had already crossed toward a blackened wooden door at the far end of the court. The lock hung broken. Inside, the warehouse stood abandoned save for crates and moldering ropes stacked beneath heavy rafters. The air smelled of damp timber and river fog. Holmes moved silently among the shadows until he halted beside a packing table near the center of the room. There, he said softly. Upon the table rested a single object. A glass medicine vial. I recognized at once the sharp medicinal odor lingering within. Chloroform, said Holmes. Gregson frowned. You think Cavendish was kidnapped? Holmes picked up the bottle thoughtfully. No. Then what? He came willingly. That answer startled us all. Holmes next examined the dusty surface of the table itself. 2 fresh impressions were visible there. One from the vial, the other from something rectangular. A document case, murmured Holmes. Gregson folded his arms. Well, Holmes looked toward him. Our missing man met someone here tonight. Drachin. Possibly. Then why not arrest him earlier? Snapped Gregson. You kept insisting he wasn't the killer. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, I still insist upon it. Before Gregson could reply, Holmes suddenly froze. From somewhere above us came a faint creaking sound. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Every man in the warehouse looked upward instantly. Holmes extinguished the lantern with one swift motion. Darkness swallowed us whole. Again came the footsteps overhead. Then silence. A low voice drifted downward through the rafters. Speaking check. Holmes answered unexpectedly in the same language. I heard Gregson mutter an astonished oath beside me. The unseen speaker replied sharply. Holmes stepped forward into the darkness. You were too late, he called calmly in English now. No answer. Then suddenly something fell from above and landed upon the floorboards near us with a metallic clang. At once came the crash of a door overhead. After him, shouted Gregson. Constables stormed toward the staircase while Holmes bent swiftly to retrieve the fallen object. It was another key. Brass. Black enamel. Number 48. Gregson returned moments later furious and breathless. Gone again. Holmes merely nodded absently. His attention had fixed upon a folded paper tied around the key with string. He opened it carefully. Inside appeared only one sentence. He has started to remember Prague. A terrible silence followed. Gregson snatched the paper irritably. What in God's name does that even mean? Holmes took the note back gently. It means, said he softly, that Mr. Cavendish is not merely being hunted. Then what is he? Holmes's face grew grave. He is being watched. We returned to Baker Street near dawn exhausted and no closer to finding Cavendish. Holmes remained unusually thoughtful throughout the journey. At last, seated once more beside our fire at 221B Baker Street, I confronted him directly. You know more than you admit. Holmes stretched his long legs toward the hearth. Considerably more. Then for heaven's sake explain. Instead of answering, he drew from his pocket the photograph found in Cavendish's room. Observe this carefully, Watson. I examined it again. Young Cavendish stood beside a stone balcony overlooking what appeared to be a European square. Well, look behind him. I peered closer. Partly obscured within the background stood another figure near the edge of the photograph. Tall, thin, face indistinct. A man watching from shadow. Good heavens, I whispered. Precisely. You believe that is Varga? Perhaps. Then why was it hidden? Holmes tapped the image thoughtfully. Because Cavendish himself never noticed it. Before I could respond, Holmes reached suddenly for an old gazetteer lying upon the table beside him. He opened it rapidly. Here, he pointed toward a page concerning Prague. The Kronenstrasse district. What about it? Holmes's finger moved lower. Then I saw it. A building marked in faded ink. The Red Room Club. I stared. A club. A remarkably discreet establishment operating during the early 1880s. For what purpose? Holmes closed the book softly. Unofficial diplomacy. Espionage. Blackmail. and Varga discovered its secrets. So it would appear. I leaned forward. But where does Cavendish fit into this? Holmes remained silent for several moments. Then quietly, what if Cavendish translated something he was never meant to read? A cold sensation passed through me. You think he possesses hidden information? Possessed, corrected Holmes. Past tense. But he claims no memory of it. Holmes's eyes hardened. Yes, and you do not believe him. Holmes stared into the fire. I believe, said he slowly, that Edwin Cavendish is genuinely terrified. That answers nothing. No, Holmes agreed softly. Because the true question is this. He turned toward me sharply. What if someone altered his memory deliberately? I could only stare. Before another word passed between us, a sudden knock sounded downstairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later, pale and shaken. There's a telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes tore it open immediately. As he read, his expression changed. Not surprise, not fear, recognition. Well, I asked. He handed it silently across. The message contained only 6 words. Come alone if you want Cavendish. Beneath it appeared a location. Charing Cross Station, midnight, and at the bottom of the telegram was drawn the now familiar symbol. A circle containing a red triangle. Holmes folded the paper carefully. Then he reached for his revolver. Watson, said he quietly, tonight we finally meet the man who waits in other people's rooms. Of all the singular adventures through which I accompanied Sherlock Holmes, few impressed me with such growing uneasiness as our journey that night toward Charing Cross railway station. The fog had lifted partially after midnight, though a cold mist still drifted above the Thames and through the gaslit streets. London possessed at that hour the strange desolation peculiar only to great cities after midnight, a silence never complete, yet filled with distant wheels, echoing footsteps, and the occasional cry of unseen cabmen somewhere beyond the darkness. Holmes sat opposite me in the hansom, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. You are armed? He asked quietly. Yes. Good. You may require steadier nerves than marksmanship tonight. That is not encouraging. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Watson, encouragement is rarely the duty of truth. I studied him carefully beneath the swaying cab lamp. You still have not explained why the telegram demanded you alone if they expected both of us. Because, said Holmes calmly, they knew perfectly well you would accompany me regardless. And how could they know that? My dear fellow, said he dryly, after 10 years even criminals begin noticing patterns. We arrived near the station shortly before midnight. The great iron arches of Charing Cross loomed above the mist like some enormous black cathedral. Porters moved ghost-like through drifting steam while late travelers hurried beneath the lamps with collars raised against the damp cold. Holmes surveyed the station rapidly. No police, said he quietly. You distrust Gregson entirely now. I distrust any visible movement. Our opponents appear unusually well informed. And you truly expect Cavendish alive? Holmes hesitated very slightly. Yes. The answer surprised me. Why? Because fear still surrounds him. Men do not waste elaborate terror upon corpses. Holmes led the way toward the less crowded eastern platform where several continental trains stood waiting in clouds of steam. Then suddenly he halted. There, a man stood alone near the far end of the platform beside a luggage trolley. Tall, thin, dark overcoat. Even before we approached nearer, I recognized Emil Drachin. He appeared entirely calm despite being officially wanted for murder. Holmes advanced without hesitation. You requested a meeting. Drachin's pale eyes shifted briefly toward me. And brought your doctor as expected. Where is Cavendish? Safe. For the moment. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. You wished to speak. Drachin glanced around the nearly deserted platform. Not here. Before Holmes could respond, a train whistle shrieked somewhere within the station. Steam rolled heavily across the lamps, swallowing half the platform in white haze. When it cleared moments later, another figure stood beside Drachin. I confess I recoiled involuntarily. The newcomer was the mysterious foreign gentleman who had visited Baker Street, the tall man with dark spectacles and scarf concealing much of his face. Yet tonight one detail differed. His gloved hands were stained with blood. Holmes noticed instantly. You are injured. The stranger ignored the remark. Time is short, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's voice sharpened. Then cease wasting it. The man removed his spectacles slowly. For the first time we saw his eyes clearly. One side of his face bore a terrible scar running from temple to jaw as though from an old knife wound. But it was not the scar which startled Holmes. It was recognition. "Good God," he whispered. The stranger gave a faint humorless smile. "Yes, you know me now." I looked rapidly between them. "Holmes." Holmes spoke very softly. "Anton Varga." A distant locomotive roared somewhere in the fog. For several seconds none of us moved. Then Cavendish's voice suddenly cried out from the darkness beyond the platform. "Holmes." We spun instantly. Cavendish stumbled from between two stationary train carriages, pale, exhausted, and visibly terrified. He had scarcely taken 3 steps toward us before another shape emerged behind him. A man in a dark bowler hat. His revolver pressed directly against Cavendish's spine. "Stay where you are," said the stranger calmly. Holmes became utterly still. The newcomer appeared ordinary at first glance: middle height, neat mustache, respectable overcoat. One might pass him daily upon London streets without notice. Yet his eyes possessed a dreadful emptiness. Varga's scarred face tightened visibly. "That is Colonel Sebastian." The man inclined his head politely. "Formerly." Holmes's gaze hardened. "The Red Room." "Yes," said Sebastian pleasantly. "Or what remains of it." Drachen moved slightly. Instantly Sebastian cocked the revolver. "I should advise against heroics." Holmes's voice remained cool. "You murdered Karl Meissner." "No, Emile did." Drachen smiled coldly. "You lie badly." Sebastian ignored him. "Mr. Holmes, your curiosity has become inconvenient." Holmes shrugged faintly. "A common complaint. You should have abandoned this matter. And permit you to continue stalking men through hidden rooms." Sebastian's smile faded. "You still misunderstand everything." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then enlighten me." For the first time Sebastian glanced toward Cavendish with something almost resembling hatred. 10 years ago in Prague," said he quietly, "Mr. Cavendish translated documents belonging to the Red Room operation." Cavendish looked utterly lost. "I remember no such thing." "You were never meant to." Holmes's expression sharpened instantly. "What was done to him?" Sebastian gave a dry laugh. "An experimental procedure. Hypnosis combined with narcotics. Primitive perhaps, but effective." I stared in astonishment. "You erased his memory." "Only partially. Enough to conceal where he hid the documents." Holmes stepped forward slightly. "And Anton Varga." Varga interfered. The scarred man spoke for the first time since revealing himself. "I tried to protect the boy." "Boy," cried Cavendish. "I was 27. You were innocent," said Varga quietly. Something in his tone silenced us all. Holmes's mind was moving rapidly now. The hidden chamber beneath Cavendish's rooms. "Mine," said Varga. "I watched him for years." "Watched him?" "To ensure they never reached him first." Cavendish looked horrified. "You sat beside my bed." "Yes." "My God. You began remembering recently," Varga continued. "That frightened them." Sebastian's voice hardened. "And now he will remember nothing ever again." The revolver pressed harder into Cavendish's back. Holmes's eyes flickered once toward me. It was the smallest movement imaginable. But after years beside him, I understood instantly. "Delay him," I spoke abruptly. "If the documents remain hidden, killing Cavendish serves no purpose." Sebastian smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Doctor. Memory often returns at the moment of death." Holmes meanwhile had shifted almost imperceptibly nearer the platform edge. Steam billowed again around us from an arriving train. Varga suddenly shouted something in Hungarian. Drachen moved like lightning. A shot exploded through the station. Passengers screamed. Cavendish tore free as Sebastian fired wildly again into the steam. Holmes launched himself forward. I saw only fragments afterward through confusion and smoke. Drachen grappling with Sebastian, Holmes striking the revolver aside, porters fleeing in panic. Then another gunshot rang out. Varga staggered backward sharply. Blood spread across his dark coat. "Varga!" cried Cavendish. The scarred man collapsed heavily against the platform bench. Sebastian broke free instantly and vanished into the swirling steam before police whistles erupted across the station. Holmes started after him but stopped abruptly beside the fallen Hungarian. Varga's breathing had become shallow. Cavendish knelt beside him in shock. "You protected me all these years." Varga managed a faint smile. "You were kind to me once in Prague." Holmes crouched swiftly beside him. "The documents," he said sharply. "Where are they?" Varga's eyes shifted weakly toward Cavendish. He hid them himself. Cavendish stared. I remember nothing. Varga's blood-stained hand seized his sleeve suddenly with surprising force. Yes, you do. The station noises seemed to fade entirely then. Varga whispered something softly in Czech. At once Cavendish's face changed. Not fear. Recognition. A terrible recognition. My God, he whispered. Holmes leaned forward instantly. What is it? Cavendish stared blankly into the fog beyond the platform. The Red Room. His voice trembled violently now. It wasn't a club. Holmes's eyes flashed. What was it? Cavendish looked slowly toward him. It was inside the embassy. And then, before another word could be spoken, all the lights along the platform suddenly went out at once. Darkness swallowed the station, and somewhere within it, a man began laughing. Darkness descended upon Charing Cross railway station so abruptly that for several seconds chaos reigned unchecked. Women screamed. Porters shouted. Somewhere a locomotive released a deafening burst of steam while boots thundered blindly across the platform. Amid the confusion, only one man appeared perfectly composed. Sherlock Holmes. Watson, he snapped sharply. The lantern. I had scarcely drawn my pocket lamp before Holmes seized my arm and dragged me toward the bench where Anton Varga lay wounded. The Hungarian still breathed, though faintly now, blood darkening the front of his coat. Cavendish knelt beside him in a near trance. He remembers, whispered Varga weakly. Holmes crouched instantly before Cavendish. What embassy? Cavendish blinked as though awakening from sleep. The Austrian embassy in Prague. What about it? The Red Room. He pressed both hands against his temples. God help me, I can see it now. Holmes's voice became extraordinarily calm. Speak slowly. The room was underground, hidden beneath the archives. Cavendish's breathing quickened. Only certain officials were permitted inside. What occurred there? Cavendish swallowed hard. Meetings, payments, names of agents. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. Go on. I translated correspondence there during the winter of 1884. Varga suspected the operation extended into England. Varga nodded weakly. It did. But why erase Cavendish's memory? I asked. Before Holmes could answer, Cavendish spoke again. Because I stole something. A silence fell. Even Holmes seemed momentarily surprised. You neglected to mention that detail earlier, said he softly. I did not remember. What did you steal? Cavendish stared blankly ahead. A ledger. Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. The Red Room records. Yes. Names. Agents. Payments. Assassinations. Good heavens, I murmured. Holmes rose slowly. And where is this ledger now? Cavendish's face twisted in visible strain. I cannot. Suddenly Varga seized Holmes's sleeve. He hid it in London. Where? Varga coughed painfully. Somewhere no one would ever search. Holmes leaned closer. What place? But before the dying man could answer, the station lights flickered back to life. Police swarmed onto the platform moments later led by furious officials and several armed constables. Gregson burst through the crowd red-faced with rage. In God's name, what happened here? Holmes pointed toward the blood-stained platform. Colonel Sebastian escaped. Gregson swore violently. And this? He stared at Varga. A witness, said Holmes quietly. Potentially dying. Gregson's eyes widened. That's Anton Varga, so it would appear. The inspector looked utterly bewildered. But he vanished 10 years ago. Yes, said Holmes dryly. He has had a busy evening. Varga was carried under guard to a nearby medical room while Holmes drew Gregson aside privately. I could not hear their conversation entirely, but fragments reached me through the station noise. Government connections. Not ordinary murder. Embassy involvement. Gregson's face grew progressively more alarmed. At length he muttered, "You expect me to tell Whitehall this? You expect me to," returned Holmes. Meanwhile Cavendish remained seated upon the bench staring into emptiness. I approached him gently. "How much do you truly remember?" His voice sounded distant. "Fragments only. Faces, rooms, voices. Can you remember where the ledger was hidden?" He closed his eyes tightly. "No, but I feel as though I am very near it." Holmes returned then, expression grave. "We leave immediately." "Where for?" I asked. "The Austrian embassy." Gregson nearly choked. "At this hour?" "At once. You've lost your senses." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Sebastian will go there tonight." "Why?" Because Cavendish has begun recovering memory. Our adversary can no longer wait. Within 40 minutes we were racing westward through deserted streets toward the embassy district. 2 plainclothes yard men accompanied us reluctantly while Gregson muttered continual objections beneath his breath. The Austrian embassy stood upon a quiet square behind iron gates and high stone walls. Its upper windows glowed dimly through the fog. Holmes halted suddenly before the entrance. No official approach. Gregson stared. You propose breaking into a foreign embassy. I propose preventing murder. That's not remotely the same thing. Holmes ignored him. Instead he turned toward Cavendish. Can you find the room? Cavendish looked pale but determined now. Yes. The side entrance yielded surprisingly easily to Holmes's tools. Within minutes we moved silently through darkened corridors heavy with the smell of dust, leather bindings, and extinguished coal fires. Cavendish led the way uncertainly at first. Then gradually with increasing confidence. This corridor, he whispered. I know this corridor. Holmes watched him closely. Memory returns through association. At the far end of the passage stood an old oak door half concealed behind shelving. Cavendish stopped before it, trembling visibly. This is it. No handle appeared upon the outer surface. Only a small brass plate bearing a symbol. A circle enclosing a red triangle. Holmes examined the lock. Watson. The duplicate key. I handed him the brass key marked 48. It slid perfectly into place. The mechanism clicked. Slowly the hidden door swung inward. A cold subterranean smell drifted outward from the darkness below. Stone steps descended beneath the embassy. Holmes drew his revolver instantly. Careful. We descended into a chamber unlike any I had seen before. The walls were painted dark crimson. Heavy curtains muffled sound entirely. A long oak table dominated the center while cabinets lined the walls filled with documents and ledgers. The Red Room. Even Gregson fell silent. Then Holmes moved swiftly toward the far cabinet. Here, several shelves stood open violently. Papers scattered across the floor. Sebastian has already searched this place, said Holmes. Cavendish stared around the chamber in mounting horror. I remember. Holmes looked sharply toward him. What? I hid the ledger here once. Once. Yes. Then where was it moved? Cavendish pressed trembling fingers against his forehead. The paintings. Holmes followed his gaze upward. Portraits lined the crimson walls. Diplomats, military officers, aristocrats. Then suddenly Cavendish pointed. There. One portrait hung slightly crooked near the fireplace. Holmes crossed rapidly and lifted it aside. Behind it lay a narrow iron compartment hidden in the wall. Empty. Gregson groaned aloud. We're too late. But Holmes had crouched suddenly near the hearth. Not quite. He held up a single burnt page fragment recovered from the ashes. Several names remained partially visible. One caused Holmes's expression to harden instantly. What is it? I asked. He handed me the fragment. There, half consumed by flame, stood a name I recognized at once. Sebastian. London operations. And beneath it another. Maury. The remainder had burned away. Holmes stared thoughtfully into the ashes. Interesting. Before I could question him further, a noise echoed faintly above us. Footsteps. Someone moving through the embassy corridors overhead. Gregson drew his revolver. He's still here. Holmes extinguished the nearest lamp instantly. Darkness swallowed the Red Room. Then came another sound. A slow creaking from somewhere behind the crimson walls themselves. Holmes turned sharply. Secret passage. Before any of us could react, a panel beside the fireplace burst inward. Colonel Sebastian emerged, revolver in hand. His expression remained perfectly calm. You continue to disappoint me, Mr. Holmes. Shots exploded simultaneously. The chamber erupted into smoke, screams, and flying splinters. I saw Gregson fall sideways clutching his arm while one constable collapsed against the table. Holmes fired once. Sebastian vanished back into the hidden passage. After him, cried Holmes. We plunged into the concealed corridor beyond. But halfway down the narrow tunnel Holmes halted abruptly. The passage ended at a stone wall. Empty. No Sebastian. No escape visible. Then Holmes lowered his lantern slowly toward the floor. Fresh blood stains marked the stones. But beside them appeared something stranger still. Bare footprints. Wet. Leading directly into the wall itself. And stopping there completely. Even Holmes stared for a long moment without speaking. Then quietly he murmured, "At last." now I understand. For several moments after discovering the footprints which ended impossibly against solid stone, none of us inside that hidden embassy passage spoke a single word. The narrow tunnel smelled of dust, damp mortar, and lingering gunpowder from the struggle moments earlier. Behind us, from the crimson chamber of the Red Room, came the groans of the wounded constable and the agitated voice of Inspector Gregson demanding more lanterns. Yet Sherlock Holmes appeared entirely absorbed by the strange marks upon the floor. Bare footprints, fresh, wet with blood, and terminating at an unbroken wall of stone. At last Gregson pushed forward angrily beside us. "Well," he demanded, "where's Sebastian gone?" Holmes touched the wall lightly with his fingertips. "He did not walk through it." Gregson snorted. "That much even I know." "Do you?" Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the lantern light. "Observe the blood pattern carefully." I crouched beside him. The final footprint lay darker than the others, as though more weight had rested upon it. "Well," said I, "our fugitive paused here, meaning he used his hands." Holmes suddenly raised the lantern toward the stone itself. There. At first I perceived nothing unusual. Then slowly I detected several tiny scratches near the mortar line scarcely visible to the naked eye. Holmes pressed firmly against one section of wall. With a dull grinding sound the stone pivoted inward. Gregson uttered a violent oath. Beyond the hidden panel lay another passage descending sharply into darkness. Holmes smiled thinly. Theatrical minds favor theatrical architecture. We advanced cautiously downward. The tunnel twisted beneath the embassy foundations before widening at last into an ancient wine cellar long abandoned. Crates lay broken everywhere, dust thick upon the floor. And near the far wall stood Colonel Sebastian himself. He had not fled. He waited calmly beside a wooden table upon which rested a single leather-bound ledger. The Red Room records. His revolver remained in his hand, though lowered. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," said he quietly. "You arrived precisely where I intended." Holmes did not raise his own weapon. "Because you wanted witnesses." Sebastian inclined his head slightly. "Exactly." Cavendish stared at the ledger with horrified recognition. "That's it." Holmes stepped forward one pace. "You cannot escape now." Sebastian gave a faint smile. "My dear Holmes, escape ceased being my objective long ago." Something in his tone unsettled me immediately. Holmes evidently felt it also. "You intend destruction," said he softly. "Correction," returned Sebastian. "Balance." He laid one hand upon the ledger. "For years governments across Europe employed men like me for unspeakable work. Then when scandals threatened, they erased us. You murdered to protect yourself. I murdered because they taught me how." Holmes's voice hardened. Self-pity is the final refuge of failed criminals. For the first time anger flickered across Sebastian's face. "You know nothing of what existed here." "I know enough." Sebastian laughed quietly. "No, Mr. Holmes, you truly do not." His eyes shifted suddenly toward Cavendish. "The doctor there believes memory theft impossible. Yet he himself translated the experiments." Cavendish recoiled visibly. "What?" Holmes turned sharply. "What experiments?" Sebastian's smile widened faintly. "Ah, so he has not remembered that part yet." Cavendish pressed trembling hands against his temples. "No, you helped develop the procedure in Prague," Sebastian continued softly. "Hypnosis, chemical suppression, memory extraction. That's a lie, is it?" Holmes's gaze had become extraordinarily intent now. "Watson," he murmured quietly, "observe Cavendish carefully." The poor fellow had gone deathly pale. Fragments seemed to tear across his expression like lightning through fog. "I translated medical reports," he whispered. "Yes," said Sebastian. "Neurological studies." "Yes." Cavendish staggered backward. "Oh God." Holmes spoke sharply. "What exactly was removed from your memory?" Sebastian answered before Cavendish could. "The location of the ledger. And now it returns." The colonel lifted the book slowly from the table. "This ledger destroys ministers, diplomats, generals, even crowned heads." Gregson muttered an astonished curse behind us. Holmes's eyes never left Sebastian. "You could have sold it years ago." "Yes, but instead you guarded it." Sebastian smiled strangely. "At first. Then why keep Cavendish alive?" A long silence followed. At last Sebastian answered softly. "Because he was innocent." That reply startled even Holmes. "Yet you pursued him across London. To see whether memory returned naturally." And if it had, Sebastian glanced down at the ledger. Then perhaps he might finally understand what was done to all of us. Holmes took another step forward. You expect sympathy? No, said Sebastian quietly. Only accuracy. Suddenly a weak voice echoed from the passage behind us. Holmes. Anton Varga appeared supported between two constables, blood soaking his bandaged side. Yet his eyes remained fierce. It ends tonight, he whispered. Sebastian looked toward him without surprise. You should have died in Prague. I nearly did. Varga's gaze shifted toward Cavendish. But the boy deserved truth. Cavendish looked shattered now. I helped them. You translated documents, said Varga gently. Nothing more. No, I remember now. Holmes turned instantly. What do you remember? Cavendish's voice trembled violently. The experiments were performed on prisoners first. Political enemies. Informants. He closed his eyes in horror. Memory loss. Personality collapse. Holmes became utterly still. And upon yourself. Cavendish nodded weakly. I volunteered. Good heavens, I breathed. Why? Asked Holmes. Because Sebastian threatened Varga. Tears stood now in Cavendish's eyes. He said they would kill him unless the ledger disappeared. Varga lowered his head silently. Holmes understood everything at once. You hid the ledger willingly. Then permitted your own memory to be erased so its location could never be betrayed. Yes, even Gregson seemed shaken now. Sebastian spoke almost wearily. There. Now the story is complete. Holmes's revolver remained steady. Not quite. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. You still lack one answer. Which? Who killed Karl Meissner? A faint smile crossed Sebastian's face again. You already know. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes. At last. Everything aligned. Meissner discovered Cavendish had begun remembering. He intended selling the information to foreign agents. Varga nodded weakly. He betrayed everyone. Drachen killed him before he could reach Sebastian. Holmes lowered his revolver slightly. A private execution. Gregson stared in disbelief. And Drachen confessed nothing. Because, said Holmes quietly, he believed the murder justified. Sebastian gave a dry laugh. You see why ordinary law fails in such matters. No, returned Holmes coldly. I see only damaged men inventing excuses for bloodshed. For the first time Sebastian's composure faltered. His eyes moved slowly around the cellar. At Varga, at Cavendish, at the ledger. Then he sighed. You were fortunate, Mr. Holmes. In what respect? You still believe truth resolves suffering. Before Holmes could reply, Sebastian suddenly hurled the ledger into the fireplace at the rear of the cellar. Flames roared upward instantly. Stop him, shouted Gregson. Holmes lunged forward, but too late. The leather binding blackened rapidly in the blaze. Sebastian raised his revolver toward the firelight. Not at us, at himself. But before he could pull the trigger, a shot cracked through the cellar. Drachen emerged from the shadows behind the wine racks. Sebastian staggered once. The revolver fell from his hand. Then slowly, almost gracefully, he collapsed beside the burning ledger. For several seconds only the flames moved. Drachen lowered his weapon. No more rooms, he said quietly. Holmes stared at him intently. You could have surrendered days ago. Yes, why not? Drachen looked toward the fire. Because none of us knew how to live outside it anymore. Sebastian gave one final shuddering breath. Then lay still. The red room had claimed its last master. Holmes stepped silently toward the fireplace and with the poker dragged part of the burning ledger clear of the flames. Several pages survived, not enough to expose governments, but enough to preserve truth. At length Holmes turned toward Cavendish. It is over. But Cavendish did not answer. He stood staring blankly into the fire with tears upon his face. Like a man remembering too much. The events within that subterranean cellar beneath the Austrian embassy marked the effective end of the Red Room affair, though its shadows lingered long afterward upon every man connected with it. Colonel Sebastian lay dead beside the dying fire. Emil Drachen surrendered without resistance to Scotland Yard, though there was something almost relieved in the gaunt Hungarian's expression as the constables escorted him away. I had the distinct impression that imprisonment represented to him not punishment, but conclusion. Anton Varga, however, survived only through extraordinary endurance. We carried him from the embassy shortly before dawn while a cold grey light crept gradually across London. The fog had finally broken, revealing streets slick with rain beneath the paling lamps. I accompanied Varga back to 221B Baker Street at Holmes's insistence, where I examined his wound properly. The bullet had passed cleanly through the upper side without striking the lung, though blood loss and exhaustion had weakened him severely. Holmes listened to my report in silence while standing beside the window. "He will live," said I at last. Holmes nodded faintly. "Good." Cavendish sat meanwhile near the fire wrapped in one of Holmes's dressing gowns. He looked like a man 20 years older than when he first entered our rooms only days earlier. Memory had returned fully, and with it came unbearable guilt. "I helped them," he said suddenly for perhaps the 10th time that morning. Holmes turned from the window. "You translated documents under coercion." "I still participated." "You attempted later to destroy the operation." "Yes, but only after I understood what it truly was." His voice cracked slightly. "They used prisoners like laboratory animals." Holmes lit a cigarette slowly. "Evil institutions frequently depend upon ordinary men convincing themselves they serve necessity." Cavendish lowered his head into trembling hands. "I volunteered for the procedure myself." "Yes," said Holmes quietly. "To protect Varga and conceal the ledger. I believed memory suppression temporary." Varga spoke weakly from the sofa. "It nearly killed you." Cavendish crossed quickly toward him. "Why did you watch me all those years?" The scarred Hungarian smiled faintly. "Because you saved my life. You sat beside my bed like a ghost. To ensure Sebastian never reached you first." Holmes exhaled smoke thoughtfully. "A remarkably theatrical method of guardianship." Varga gave the ghost of a laugh which ended painfully in coughing. "I spent too many years among spies, Mr. Holmes. One forgets ordinary behavior." It was near noon when Inspector Gregson arrived from Scotland Yard looking thoroughly exhausted and deeply irritated. "You've handed me a nightmare," he announced without preamble. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Only one." Gregson ignored the remark. "The Foreign Office already wants the entire embassy incident buried." "Naturally. And there are surviving pages from that blasted ledger naming officials in 3 governments." Holmes glanced toward the fire. "Burn them." Gregson stared. "You're serious?" "Entirely. But they're evidence. They are dynamite." The inspector paced angrily across the room. "You always complain about corruption, Holmes. Yet now you want the truth hidden." Holmes's expression hardened slightly. "No, I want catastrophe avoided." Gregson threw up his hands. "I never understand your morality." "My dear inspector," said Holmes quietly, "neither do governments." Gregson snorted but produced a folded document from his coat. "There's another matter." Holmes took the paper and read it silently. For the first time in many hours, genuine amusement touched his face. "Excellent. What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the document. It proved to be an official notice declaring Emil Drachen solely responsible for the murder of Karl Meissner and all associated crimes. No mention whatsoever appeared of Sebastian, or the Red Room, or the embassy chamber beneath Prague. "A convenient fiction," said I. "An essential one," replied Holmes. Cavendish looked up sharply. "But Sebastian ordered murders across Europe. And now he is dead," said Holmes. "History prefers tidy endings." Varga's tired eyes shifted toward Holmes with sudden interest. "You understand more than most men." Holmes smiled faintly. "I understand that civilization rests upon a very thin crust, Mr. Varga." A curious silence followed. At length Cavendish rose slowly from his chair. "There is still one thing I cannot comprehend." Holmes glanced toward him. "Yes, the messages. What about them? Who kept leaving them in my rooms?" Holmes's eyes drifted briefly toward Varga. The Hungarian gave the smallest possible shrug. "You wrote them," whispered Cavendish. "Yes. But why such terror?" Varga's scarred face became grave. "Because fear kept you alert. And the hidden chamber. I built it beneath your lodgings years ago after bringing you to London." Cavendish stared in astonishment. "You watched me for 10 years. "Yes." "Good Lord." Holmes tapped ash lightly into the tray. "The strategy was effective, though perhaps psychologically unkind." Varga looked suddenly older than ever. I had seen what Sebastian's men did to those who remembered too soon. Cavendish sank back into his chair silently. I confess that despite everything, a lingering question still troubled me. "Holmes," said I, "there remains one detail unexplained." "Only one." "We progress admirably. The footprints ending at the wall beneath the embassy." Holmes smiled. Ah, Gregson groaned aloud. Not another lecture. Holmes ignored him pleasantly. The hidden panel pivoted inward. Sebastian knew precisely where to place his feet while operating the mechanism. Blood drops concealed the slight groove near the mortar line, and the barefooted intruder misses. Willoughby described. Varga, said Holmes simply. The Hungarian nodded faintly. I removed my shoes entering Cavendish's rooms through the passage to avoid waking him. Gregson shook his head in disbelief. For days London's terrified over a ghost. Holmes leaned back in his chair. Human beings, my dear Inspector, almost invariably prefer supernatural explanations to carefully observed facts. And Cavendish's memory returning, Holmes's expression grew thoughtful again. That, said he softly, is perhaps the most dangerous phenomenon of all. Toward evening Varga insisted upon leaving Baker Street despite my objections. I cannot remain in England, he said quietly. Too many old ghosts here. Cavendish looked stricken. Will I ever see you again? The scarred Hungarian smiled faintly. I sincerely hope not. Before departing, however, he paused beside Holmes. You saved him. Holmes shook his head slightly. No, you did. Varga studied him for a long moment. Be careful, Mr. Holmes. Of what? The world changing. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. It always changes. Yes, said Varga softly. But men like Sebastian are becoming modern. Without another word he departed into the darkening London evening. We never saw him again. That night Holmes remained unusually silent beside the fire while I completed my notes concerning the affair. At length I closed my notebook. One aspect still troubles me. Holmes stretched languidly upon the sofa. Only one. You realized very early that Cavendish himself concealed the central secret. Yes. Then why not confront him immediately? Holmes's gaze fixed upon the fire. Because memory cannot be forced safely. You feared damaging him further. Holmes shrugged slightly. I feared truth arriving too suddenly. Outside Baker Street the rain had begun again, whispering softly against the windows. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then Holmes murmured quietly, the curious thing, Watson, is that Sebastian was correct about one matter. What matter? That memory defines identity. Holmes reached for his violin thoughtfully. A man deprived of his past becomes extraordinarily vulnerable to whoever supplies him with a new one. I watched the firelight flicker across his sharp features. You sound almost sympathetic toward Sebastian. Holmes drew the bow slowly across the strings. No, said he softly. Only cautious. And as the violin's melancholy notes drifted through Baker Street, I found myself wondering whether the true horror of the Red Room had not been murder or espionage. But the terrible realization that the human mind itself might someday become a battlefield. In setting down the concluding events of this singular adventure, I am conscious that many readers may find portions of the narrative difficult to reconcile with ordinary experience. Yet I can affirm, upon my honor as a medical man and longtime companion of Sherlock Holmes, that every detail herein recorded occurred precisely as described. The affair of the stranger waiting in my room ended quietly. No triumphant headlines announced the destruction of the Red Room. No public trials exposed the hidden operations beneath European diplomacy. London passed onward in its accustomed rhythm of fog, commerce, and scandal, entirely unaware how near certain dangerous secrets had come to the surface. Within a fortnight the official version of events had solidified conveniently. Emil Drachen confessed to the killing of Karl Meissner during a dispute among former political associates. Colonel Sebastian did not officially exist. The embassy incident became an unfortunate security disturbance. Several foreign clerks resigned unexpectedly from government service. A handful of documents vanished forever into locked archives. And life continued. Yet for those directly touched by the case, ordinary existence proved more elusive. Edwin Cavendish remained for several weeks under my observation at 221B Baker Street. The return of memory did not come as a single revelation but rather in painful fragments, each surfacing unexpectedly through places, scents, or spoken phrases. More than once I found him staring blankly into the fire as recollection overtook him. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after the embassy affair, he spoke at last with unusual calmness. I remember Prague clearly now. Holmes, who lounged upon the sofa with eyes half closed, did not look up from his monograph concerning medieval ciphers. Do you? Said he quietly. Yes. And how does memory compare with imagination? Cavendish gave a weary smile. Less merciful. I had noticed already that Holmes treated the man with a curious gentleness rare in his dealings with clients. Perhaps he recognized that Cavendish's greatest punishment would not come from courts or governments, but from his own conscience. "You were manipulated," said I firmly. "Yes," replied Cavendish, "but manipulation does not erase responsibility." Holmes set aside his papers at last. "My dear fellow, every human institution upon earth survives by persuading decent men to commit questionable acts in the name of necessity." Cavendish looked toward him. "And that excuses them." "Not in the least." Holmes lit a cigarette slowly. "But clarity is more useful than guilt." For a time Cavendish considered leaving England entirely. Yet in the end he accepted a modest post translating medical journals for a private publisher in Sussex, far removed from politics or diplomacy. He visited Baker Street only once afterward. I remember the occasion distinctly. Rain lashed the windows while Holmes played softly upon the violin near the fire. Cavendish stood for several moments looking around our familiar sitting room with an expression difficult to define. Relief perhaps, or gratitude. "At night," said he quietly, "I still wake expecting to see someone seated beside my bed." Holmes lowered the violin. "And do you?" "No." A faint smile touched Holmes's thin lips. "Then you are recovering." Cavendish hesitated before speaking again. "There is something I never properly said." Holmes waved the matter aside almost impatiently. "My dear sir, if you intend gratitude, spare us both discomfort." Nevertheless Cavendish crossed suddenly toward him and extended his hand. Holmes regarded it a moment before taking it briefly. "You gave me back my life," said Cavendish. "No," Holmes replied softly. "Only your memory." After the man departed, I turned toward my friend thoughtfully. "You liked him." Holmes resumed tuning the violin strings. "I found him human." "That is not always your preferred quality." "No," Holmes admitted dryly. "But it remains statistically common." As for Anton Varga, no confirmed trace of him was ever discovered after his departure from London. Holmes believed he escaped eventually to South America under another name. "Men trained in disappearance seldom retire publicly," said he. And Emil Drachin. He died some years later in prison following a fever outbreak, though Holmes once remarked with curious seriousness that Drachin may have been the only participant in the affair who fully understood the Red Room's true nature. "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes stretched before the fire thoughtfully. "The others believed the Red Room was an organization. And it was not. It was also an idea." "What idea?" Holmes's eyes reflected the firelight strangely. "That governments, given sufficient fear, will eventually attempt to control not merely actions, but thought itself." I confess the remark unsettled me profoundly. "You believe such things possible?" "My dear Watson," said Holmes quietly, "human ambition rarely limits itself voluntarily." The matter might have ended there entirely had one final incident not occurred several months later. It was a bitter winter evening. Holmes and I had just concluded supper when Mrs. Hudson entered carrying the post. Among the usual correspondence lay a single envelope without address or seal. Holmes opened it casually. Then his expression altered ever so slightly. "What is it?" I asked. Without speaking, he handed me the contents. Inside rested only a small photograph. It showed a sunlit harbor somewhere abroad. Several figures stood upon the docks beside a steamship preparing to depart. At first glance the image appeared entirely ordinary. Then I noticed the man near the far edge of the frame. Tall, thin, partially turned away, watching the camera from shadow. Even after all that had passed, the sight sent a chill through me. "Varga," I whispered. "Possibly." I turned the photograph over. Written upon the back in neat black ink were 6 words. "The room is closed. Let him sleep." For several moments Holmes said nothing. Then at last he crossed quietly to the fire and dropped the photograph into the flames. "You are destroying it." "Yes." "Why?" Holmes watched the edges curl black within the firelight. "Because some doors, Watson, are healthiest left unopened." The violin lay upon the chair beside him. Outside Baker Street the wind moved softly through the London fog while distant carriage wheels echoed faintly along the wet streets. I studied my friend carefully then, struck once more by the extraordinary contradictions within his character. Cold yet compassionate, detached yet fiercely protective, a man capable of penetrating the darkest recesses of human deception while still preserving some private faith in reason itself. At length Holmes reached again for the violin. What became, I asked quietly, of the surviving pages from the ledger? He paused before answering. Burned. All of them. A faint smile touched his face. My dear Watson. He drew the bow gently across the strings. I did not say by whom. And so ended the affair of the stranger who waited in another man's room, a case which taught me that there exist horrors far subtler than violence or death. For a bullet may end a life, but the theft of memory threatens the very soul itself. Even now, years later, whenever I wake unexpectedly in darkness and glimpse some motionless shape near the bedside chair before reason fully returns, I feel again that old involuntary chill. And I remember the words Holmes spoke on the final night of the affair. The most dangerous rooms in the world, Watson, are often those hidden inside the human mind.